Welcome to Idea Collider, a regular podcast hosted by me, Mike Rea, where I speak with the people who I regard as the most interesting within the pharmaceutical space, or I talk with the authors of the books that I've found most interesting on the subject of innovation. So, enjoy. So, welcome to another in the series of Idea Collider, and I'm delighted to, in the wake of their placing in the Pharmaceutical Innovation Index, welcome Dan Skovronsky to the podcast. Rather than beat about the bush, Dan, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your route to, where you are and how you got there?
Yeah, sure, Mike. Thanks. Maybe I start out by thanking you for the opportunity to talk to you. It's a pleasure to be together here on the show. I'm Dan Skovronsky. I'm president of Lilly Research Laboratories. That's the part of Eli Lilly and Company that's responsible for research and development of new drugs as well as business development. And I'm also chief scientific officer as well as chief medical officer of Eli Lilly and Company. I've been at Lilly for a little more than 10 years, really since Lilly acquired a biotech company, which I was the CEO called Avid Radiopharmaceuticals. I was the founder of that company working in Alzheimer's disease. And that's what brought me to Lilly. Before that, I trained as a scientist, MD, PhD, and then I went on to do a residency in pathology and a fellowship in neuropathology. So many years of academic training before I became a biotech entrepreneur and then eventually a big pharma exec.
That's interesting, and I will come back to that journey from biotech CEO to large pharma and the kind of contrasts as you get into it. I guess the first question is, which do you enjoy more?
Well, the opportunity that we have in large pharmaceutical companies is incredible. So I truly enjoy it. It's the opportunity and privilege of a lifetime, really, to be able to direct R&D resources, talent, and dollars at such a scale to improve human health. And it's never boring, that's for sure. There's always something happening in the portfolio, and so much opportunity to touch people's lives with new medicines that help sick people feel better. That's what gets me up every morning.
And I guess the last 18 months could have been the least boring of your career.
Yeah, that's for sure. And there's no place I would have rather been than at the helm of a big pharma company R&D org at the moment when the biggest public health crisis of our lifetimes, for sure, so far, maybe forever, I hope, it strikes. And so it was gratifying to be able to do something. We did our part in the fight against COVID, for sure.
Absolutely. And I guess probably on that subject, I mean, one of the questions that a lot of heads of R&D have faced is, what have you done differently this year than before? And has it been something that you'll continue to do after this?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about that topic. I mean, for starters, of course, our purpose has always been the same. Lilly's, this year we're celebrating our 145th anniversary, 145 years as a company under the same name in the same place with the same mission to make medicines from out of science, right, with the highest levels of quality. And yet, despite the clarity and consistency of our purpose, the last 15 months have just made it so much more clear. Every employee has felt connected to that purpose, and I felt more connected to that purpose than ever before as we threw ourselves in the fight against COVID-19. The first company with monoclonal antibodies against the virus, which have been hugely successful. We also are, I think, the only company that has both a therapy for early, diagnosed patients in monoclonal antibodies, and then also in hospitalized patients. We have an immune modulator that is also under emergency use authorization. We threw ourselves into testing, and we set up testing labs really to a huge extent. We delivered direct testing for patients. We did it all without ever charging a patient a penny. And so we've all felt so connected with our purpose. And I think we just sort of take that forward now against all the other therapeutic areas, right? So many people died of COVID-19 for sure, but the death toll from diabetes and obesity and related, cardiovascular disease and liver disease and kidney disease is even higher. And that's also a pandemic that we can fight. Alzheimer's disease is also affecting millions of people around the world, and we can fight that. So can we bring that same sense of urgency, the same purpose-driven activity, the collaboration across other companies, across academia and the government? Can we have an Operation Warp Speed for Alzheimer's disease or for diabetes? I think that's what the future holds. It won't be perfect. We won't be as good as we were against COVID, against every other disease, but we can't unsee what we saw there. And we know what the potential really is when it's fully unharnessed now.
Yeah, and I think that's such an interesting observation that, the things that changed probably weren't the things that you did. They were the kind of either the decision-making or the urgency or the passion or the connectedness. And I've heard a few folks repeat that and say, well, we can keep some of that as we move forward.
Yeah, and it wasn't just that our eyes were open to our potential. I would say our eyes were also open to some unfortunate things. There's always been inequality and equity in how healthcare is distributed here in the United States and around the world, for sure. COVID-19 made that so much more clear, right? It was always there, but with the pandemic, you were forced to come to terms with it. And so it reinvigorated our efforts around equity in healthcare distribution, in diversity and inclusion, in our clinical trials, and in our partners around the world. It redoubled our commitment to helping lower and lower middle income countries and make sure they have access to medicine. So by opening our eyes to hardship, it, I think, invigorated us to fight harder against it. There were other things too, of course. It's probably been frequently said, and that we've relied on the use of technology so much more because of COVID-19. That's helped in clinical trials. So in other words, when we couldn't have patients come to clinics, we saw them through telemedicine, or their doctors saw them through telemedicine. When they couldn't go to the academic center for their imaging study or their blood draw, we figured out how to have it done near their home or send a nurse to their home and get work done there. Those are things we're keeping. We don't want to go back to the old ways. Those things our patients appreciate in clinical trials, and they unlock participation in research to a much broader, more diverse audience. So that's good news that we'll keep.
And I think that I've written a lot about this idea of serendipity, right? Is that, it isn't about luck per se, it's about seeing an opportunity in something that just happened, and that and that's essentially what you're describing, is that the opportunity presented by having to rely on technology like that actually does present for those that want to take that lesson forward, a real opportunity to do it differently.
Yeah, and it's not that we didn't know it before or we weren't working on it. Everybody in the industry has been working on decentralized clinical trials and virtual clinical trials for the last decade. But you can look at the pharma industry and say we were laggards in the adoption of new technology in clinical trials compared to every other aspect of our daily lives, which is transformed by technology even before the pandemic. Clinical trials were still basically done the same way they were done 20 or 30 or even 50 years ago. So it took a pandemic to force change.
Yeah. Why do you think that is? What's the anchor to the way it was done rather than the way it could be?
Yeah, change is hard for sure in every aspect of life, particularly in things as complex as drug development. It has to be one of the most complicated and risky and expensive endeavors in humanity to develop new drugs. And so there's resistance to change and conservatism. I gave a talk to my teams, and I said, look, I know change is hard. I'm really proud of how we changed. It's hard to change during a pandemic for sure. But remember, it's even harder to change when there isn't a crisis.
Yes.
And we needed a crisis to force some changes. And so I hope those will be positive changes around the conduct of clinical trials and around equity in healthcare distribution, that improvements will come.
Yeah, and certainly that idea that you could hit two things with one stone, if you like, on the way forwards. That this might solve for a lot of that. So maybe to loop back to that the kind of culture of innovation within the organization. I guess the first question is, do you have a definition of innovation within Lilly that you work towards?
Well, there's all kinds of innovation, and sometimes people say capital I innovation or little innovation. But let me start with the biggest kind of innovation that we think about, and for me, it's just so clear. It doesn't happen that often. Maybe once a decade or once every few years, if you're really, really good, a new medicine comes along that writes a new chapter in human history, and you never can look back and not recognize it changed everything. For people with that disease. That's what we're going for. Our company has had this R&D organization now for more than 100 years. I'm the 10th person to lead it. And my goal is that during my tenure, however long that lasts, that we have at least one of these game-changing innovations that rewrites medical history. And I can just count them off in our history of our company. We've been lucky. The modern Eli Lilly exists because of insulin. We didn't discover insulin, but we certainly were among the first to recognize the potential to help patients, and collaborated with the discoverers in Toronto to be the manufacturer of most of the insulin that was produced in the United States. That was a huge advance. No one can write the history of diabetes without talking about Eli Lilly and insulin. Yeah. We did the same thing with penicillin. We weren't the inventor, but for sure, but we were the leading manufacturer of penicillin to help the U.S. in World War II, which was a really important contribution to the war effort. Vinca alkaloids, right? Vincristine, vinblastine, literally was Lilly scientists going to Madagascar, jungles and bringing back periwinkles and isolating those chemicals, which changed the history of oncology and chemotherapies. Cephalosporins, Lilly discovered the first cephalosporin, the second cephalosporin, the third, and that's part of the history of antibiotics that we wrote. Prozac, right, the drug that was on the cover of Time magazine, and made us rethink about how we treat mental illness and how we think about depression, and we followed with Cymbalta for sure. Those things come upon us, once a generation or once a decade, and they're the innovations we're most proud of. Maybe we've done something like that already with our COVID therapies. Maybe that's yet to come in Alzheimer's disease and our next generation treatments for diabetes and obesity. I think it's likely we'll have more innovations like that. That's the big innovation. Those are the things that really matter for the history of humanity, and that's where we're focused. But we know to get those, we need the smaller kinds of innovations. We need innovations like I described in how we run our clinical trials. That's innovation also in how we do research, in the types of technologies we bring, in how we organize ourselves, in how we reach patients and reach doctors with new information. All of those are pieces of innovation that can help enable that sort of rewriting of medical history that we all desperately want to be part of.
Yeah, it's interesting. So do you sort of pre-write medical history in that sense? Do you know that you have them before they're there? I guess that's the billion-dollar question.
We try, of course, but we also have to be humble. We get excited about molecules in early development and say, maybe this is it. We sometimes use the word game changer. This could be a game changer for patients. Most of the time we're wrong, of course. It's a tough business. But we're inspired by that hope. And then as molecules get later in development, we get more and more confident if they stay on that game changer trajectory. Like I said, we have a couple in the company now, particularly a drug for diabetes and obesity and a drug for Alzheimer's that have that potential. But, sometimes you don't even know until you have the benefit of time and history, and you can look back and look back over the last decade and say, oh, well, that one really mattered. This other one that we thought would be great turned out to be just okay. These things are hard to predict. So probably to get those, we need to aim for them, first of all, because if you never try to have those kinds of breakthroughs, you probably won't. And then second, we just have to be humble about our predictive abilities and therefore say, we need to launch a lot of new medicines and set a number of ships sailing, because we're not sure which one gets to the destination, which really can become that kind of game changer. Yeah. So that those are both aspects of our strategy, focusing on the really big bets, but then also having enough sustaining innovation or other kinds of innovation, sometimes that we get surprised and one of them turns into that kind of a game changer.
Yeah, so it's like the sort of Pixar version of Disney, I guess. You know, you get the model dialed in, and then you try and do it more often. It's but you can't predict which one's going to be the winners. But I'm interested because you use that kind of capital I, small I innovation piece. Do you approach innovation? You know, does it have a division within the company, as some companies do? Do you approach it as an active process?
Yeah, it's an active process. Of course, in a pharmaceutical company, like the whole research and development organization, which is something like 7,000 people and a budget of $6 to $7 billion a year, is all we do is innovation. We try to be deliberate about saying when we're taking our moonshots, and when we're doing sort of sustaining innovation. That's also important and valued for patients, and necessary, but more incremental and not, not history making. We need them both. And like I said, early in the discovery process, you don't really know for sure which one you're going to get.
And in terms of, I guess, the incremental improvements that, is your organization set up so that the people responsible for, say, clinical trial recruitment are continually innovating, and how does all of that sort of join up together into the big lessons?
Yeah, that's a good point. So those kinds of innovations in how we do our work, we do have dedicated groups, really almost within every function. There'll be a group of people in that function who are in charge, not just of delivering the portfolio, working on a particular molecule, but also reinventing how we do work. And, is there, so like in the statistics group, there's a group of statisticians who are working on innovation, in that they're working to develop and apply new statistical methods that can help us analyze data. In the clinical trial operations group, there's groups on things like transformation of clinical trials. Every part of the company, we have that, from CMC to biotechnology to clinical trials. So it's luxury, I would say, of being at a big pharma company, that you can do that. At a biotech company, it's pretty much all hands on deck for the product that you have, because getting that product developed is what's key. At a big company, you have the luxury of also stepping back a little and reflecting on how you do the work and thinking of ways to do it better. And that's fun too.
That's interesting. And I guess because, that mantra of you get what you measure has long sort of pervaded this industry, which I think is probably true in clinical trials at least. But in terms of culture, do you measure innovation within your group, or is it a more organic piece?
Yeah, of course we do. Big companies love to measure everything. So we have a couple different ways. So one, and the most straightforward one, is we ask our employees a lot of questions about innovation and how innovative they feel and how innovative is the company and their team, and we track that, how connected they are to our purpose, which is, as I said before, to create medicines that make life better. What better purpose is there? And you can just imagine through the course of the pandemic, our teams have felt more connected to our purpose, more innovative than ever before, which is great news. But it's not enough if we all look at each other and pat each other on the backs and say we're innovative. We need external measures as well. So we have a number of those. The ones that I watch most carefully are probably focus on 3 external measures. So one is really it's just the late stage portfolio. It's the outside view of how much value we're creating in the late stage portfolio. And that's easy because there's so many analysts that follow our industry. They put numbers on every drug. We download them and catalog them and see how Lilly's doing versus other companies. Right now, we're number 1. Our portfolio is the most highly valued of anyone in the industry, which is great. that's super exciting. Of course, it's also highly volatile, and hopefully we'll launch those extremely highly valued molecules, and they'll turn into medicines, and they'll be out of the portfolio, and we'll have to replace them with new things. So that's what we expect. But we measure that over long periods of time. So how much value did we create from research and development? And then we compare that to how much did we invest in research and development. And that's sort of a productivity measure over long periods of time. And we do that not just for Lilly, but for every company in our industry. And we see how we rank on that metric as well, because ultimately we want to differentiate, generate more value for patients, and value assessed by analysts as a surrogate for value for patients versus investment. So that's one thing we look at. Alongside that is the number of patients we reach each year. That's for our launched medicines. So it's easy to catalog revenues. It's harder to catalog lives impacted, but we try. Yeah. And like I said, with respect to COVID, our eyes are open. Lives count the same wherever they live. And if they're in a country that has less GDP, they're going to pay less for medicines. That doesn't mean those lives are less important. So I think just counting the number of lives touched by our medicines is hugely important, and then improving that every year. On the R&D side, in the earlier stage portfolio, the two metrics we look at that are most easily quantified, objective, are timelines. And here, over the last 5 or 10 years, Lilly's gone from probably the slowest in the industry to probably the fastest. We just had a concerted effort on getting faster in drug development. We can talk about all the specific tools, but that's been huge. And our cycle time has come down over that time period by 5 years. We've taken 5 years out of R&D. And then probability of success. So when you start a molecule, how often do you get to phase 1? How often do you get to phase 2, phase 3, and launch? And there again, we compare against peers, particularly late-stage failures, which are just devastating to productivity because you put so much time and money and opportunity costs. So improving the probability of success, which now is quite good at Lilly, has been a huge journey and an important mission. I think if you can develop drugs with at least average, if not better than average, probability of success, and do it faster than other companies, that's a good recipe for success. And so that's important to us.
No, it's interesting, especially the piece about the sort of value creation piece, because I think that one thing that we reflect in the index is that as you say, we start with that basic question of the same molecule, 2 different companies, it will have different probability of success, right? According to the criteria, but the analysts themselves attribute less to the company than I think they should. They're often looking at the molecule and doing their own assessments of where it would go in a generic pharmaceutical company. But that ability to create value is clearly intrinsic to your organization. So it's just interesting to hear that you drill down into some of those pieces of purpose and speed and so forth.
Yeah, I think with respect to the analysts, of course, they try and predict revenues and then earnings. And our sales and marketing group is in charge of revenues and mostly the earnings. But the stock price depends on the PE ratio. Right. And maybe the R&D group's in charge of the ratio, right? Because it represents the excitement over the future and the sustainability of innovation in the company. And so we watch that also. And
Yeah, and it's interesting because it does come down to humans and the decisions that they make collectively as a group, and I think that people do underestimate that organizations can achieve great success or not, and there's no such thing as an average pharmaceutical company. So, some companies have enjoyed very little success over the last few years, despite spending the same amount of money that Lilly has, I think, and I think that's where you start to say, well, look, this is where teams are not the same, even when they're playing with the same level of investment.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, there's just so many traps and pitfalls that an organization can fall into. And, it's a complicated business for sure. And we're often on the horns of a dilemma, which are, there's sometimes really the great ideas and the huge game-changing molecules that are described. It feels good to say we're going to divert all of our resources into these few projects. But then eventually those will become great drugs for sure. And generate tremendous value for patients. The amazing thing about our industry, and probably unique, is one day they will be generic and they'll be gone.
Yeah.
And so you have to have a continual flow of innovation. Every decade, it's a whole new slate of products. We have to reinvent ourselves. And so you can never let your foot off that gas of innovation and say, I'm just going to, maximize the assets I have. You always need to be asking what's next and what's next.
Mm-hmm. And because you've seen life from both sides of biotech and, the sort of development within Lilly, what would you say have been the kind of major learnings over that period of, either what was great about biotech, what's great about large pharma, what would you have done differently had you had your time over again?
Oh, yeah. I'm not much one for thinking about doing things differently. I'm pretty satisfied. But I think the thing about pharma that we have that's just unparalleled is the resources, the people, and the money, and the stability of that, and continuity of that, which then leads to institutional learning and development of expertise and really excellence. Investing in functional know-how and technologies, and so that's just incredible. What's incredible about biotech is the conviction, right? It's often a sink or swim around the conviction around an asset or a technology or an idea. That's valuable. The focus that comes with that conviction and comes with the often the inadequate resources forces you to focus on the best opportunities. That's hugely valuable. And then probably, the opposite of, again, the pharma company, which you have the stability, which is, from the perspective of investment and career, because you don't have that in biotech, you got to sweat the small stuff and the big stuff. And so there's this personal involvement of leaders in biotech companies that are, their lives are at stake as much as every employee's, meaning they're often involved in the details of clinical trial execution or regulatory strategy or regulatory interactions or discovery strategies or decisions. I think that matters, actually. And so what I've tried to do at Lilly, and I'm not fully successful here for sure, is to try and marry the best of both worlds. It's easy to say, but not easy to do. And so within the walls of a large pharmaceutical company with the resources, create smaller groups, often that still look like biotech companies. So we actually have biotech companies that we've acquired over the years, including the company that I came from 10 years ago, Avid, that still exist as biotech companies within our walls, operating in the same way. The biggest one is Loxo Oncology, an oncology company we bought. And not only did we bring them in and sort of say, keep doing what you're doing, we gave them the rest of the oncology portfolio and said, also run our portfolio that way. And let's see how we can scale this biotech company within our walls. That's going great, hugely successful experiment. And then there's a number of other smaller ones. So I think doing that, and then within our own portfolio of internally discovered molecules, we've tried to set ourselves up a little bit more like biotech companies. It's, as I said, imperfect. But one thing I did early in my tenures, I tried to abolish as many committees as possible and dismantle the bureaucracy that pharma companies rely on to run R&D. It's a big enterprise. That probably just needs to be cleaned out every couple of years of pharma companies because they creep back in. Instead say, okay, we're going to set up the molecules in our portfolio essentially as little companies, and each one will have a leadership team and each one will have a board of directors. And that's the way we'll provide the governance. Instead of the teams coming to committees for approval to go forward, the committee will stick with the team. And they'll have their board of directors, which will meet whenever they need to, like a biotech company. They're the ones who will allocate the budget over multiple years. They're the ones who will make go, no go decisions and move the molecules forward. So that's been hugely engaging, actually. The teams love it. The people doing the work find it much, much more satisfying and faster decision making. But what was surprising is the leaders of the various functions and committees who maybe, you might have guessed would be opposed, they almost all tell me, like, this is the best thing I've done in my career. Like, I love being on the boards of these companies within Lilly, these boards of these teams, because I'm closer to the projects and more engaged in the projects than I've ever been, which is hugely fun. So that seems to work well. But, like I said, it's a constant challenge, and constantly it is, the main part of my job, I think, is focused on bringing those two worlds together and getting the best out of both of them.
That's really interesting, and apologies for not knowing that in advance. That approach isn't common in our industry. The idea that you would delegate decision making or sort of timeliness, because people do seem to continue to rely on the 6 monthly reviews and the toll gates and the kind of the reliance on prediction instead of uncertainty.
The mass production of R&D, which hasn't really been super successful.
No, quite the opposite. It's almost been unsuccessful, but we keep doing it anyway because it's comfortable. But the thing about culture is interesting, and you mentioned Loxo. That was a question I was going to ask you. Is often we see companies come into organizations that are allowed to be who they are for a while, and then they get subsumed. At some point, because they're often the more successful part of the company. So I'm thinking of like MedImmune or Genentech, or they then become the organization. But one of the things we've seen with other companies that acquire is that the decisions that you'll take in, say, hepatitis C are not the same as you might take in oncology. So as soon as you start centralizing the decision making, you've got a bunch of people that you're either teaching about oncology or you're teaching about hepatitis C, or in order to make a decision with the information they're presented. So that delegation of decision making is kind of a potent insight into the way that you're running things. Yeah.
Well, of course, though, it all relies on and assumes that you have great people. And so, obviously, that's, anyone will say that's the most important ingredient here. If you have great people that you can trust, why do you think, why would you be uncomfortable delegating to them? And particularly, it's easier when it's a biotech company on the outside that you've acquired, and you say, well, look, we pay billions of dollars because we like the decisions they've made over the last few years. It's easier in that case. But of course, internally, we have great people also, and it is challenging, of course, and giving up power and delegating to others is not easy, and something we all struggle with.
Yeah, it's kind of quiet power, I guess, at the same time.
Yeah. Whenever people tell me about their best career experiences at Lilly or anywhere, probably, they always say it's, I was working on a small team, there was time pressure, it was really important for the company, and it was just delegated for us to figure it out, and we did it. Yeah. That's like, and I can think of my own career as well. Those are the most exciting things, when you're in the trenches with a team you trust, working on a project, and it's all up to you all to fix it or solve it or make it into medicine. That's what's rewarding. And so we got to think of ways to give our employees and our teams that experience.
Yeah.
Sometimes I do it myself. I like to be involved in certain projects.
Yeah, well, I've often seen people's eyes light up when they've had to go back into a skunk works, and the leaders of the organizations are now hands-on, and you see their eyes light up when they're discussing that experience, because I think that the daily grind of the process can sometimes become overwhelming.
That's right. Yeah, but the scalability of that approach is limited too, right? How many projects can I be personally involved in? Surely I was highly involved, still am in our COVID response efforts. I'm highly involved in Alzheimer's. That's my background. But at that level of involvement, I couldn't do it. In other areas, I don't have the expertise or the bandwidth. So, having a cohort of leaders that can do it in different areas is hugely important. And talent is the rarest and most important commodity. It's not a commodity, most important asset. I think, and there again, there's differences between biotech and pharma. Right now, biotech is an alluring place for people to go, and many talented scientists and leaders want to be in biotech. On the other hand, I try and show them the great things about pharma and the idea that it really comes back to the breadth of the impact we can have in a big company.
And if you can get the best of both worlds, even better. I mean, I've always said that the problem is that portfolios are typically diverse, right? They got numbers of different shots on goal, but the number of approaches that companies take to developing medicines is usually like one. So they don't have any diversity of approach either. So they're not really doing experiments in that sense.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when we think about biotech companies, people usually jump to the asymmetry of financial rewards that biotech companies give outsized rewards for risk taking. But I haven't found that to be the problem. I think it's actually just the connection to the work and being able to see your personal impact on the work. That's the valuable part about biotech, and that's what you have to create in big pharma. Is people have to see that their work, exactly how their work matters and how it impacts the project, and that they're making a difference. Then they're fully motivated.
Yeah, and I had the same question for one of the guys at Google X about their kind of incubator group, because I'd always assumed that there'd be some incentive to start a company at Google, that you might get paid for having been the guy that started AdWords or the woman that started the kind of the revenue model, and they have 330 different teams that are essentially internal teams. So the question was, how do you incentivize them? And so, well, so what do they get? They're allowed to do it. That's it. There's no incentive, there's no stake, because the energy that they apply when they're allowed to do it is huge.
Yeah, and I mean, if Google can motivate people because they get to work on AdWords, I mean, we have no problem. We're motivating people to work on a cure for Alzheimer's disease or cancer. Sure, of course, that's easy to motivate people for. So in some sense, managers of pharma company, our job is easier than just about any other company, because the work we do is inherently interesting, inherently challenging, and inherently good for humankind.
Yeah, fantastic. Where the time's going to run away from us, and I often don't get to ask the kind of interesting ones about you towards the end. So I'd be interested. So, I mean, you've taken a career through Alzheimer's, and I guess you're still involved in Alzheimer's, but I don't want to assume that's at the core of it. So what drives you personally then?
It's the impact. I guess when I thought about pursuing a career in clinical medicine, the impact is the number of patients you touch in a day. That's great, and you can help a certain number of people. Maybe in academic medicine, it's a bit more. You can write some papers that people will read, and maybe they'll go on and do some great things from that and advance the science and eventually lead to medicines. In biotechnology, and you have a chance to develop a couple of drugs, maybe in a great career in biotech, you can be responsible for a few. In a pharma company, it's dozens of drugs. In the sort of decade that I've been deeply involved in research and development at Lilly, we'll launch 20 molecules, 20 new medicines, and some of them are really big ones, and that's a huge impact. And so for me, it's just waking up every day with really challenging problems where I get to do science, which I want to do, right? And there's lots of challenging science to do, and you could be building rocket ships or electric cars or whatever. That's great, but doing challenging scientific things that impact millions of people who are sick and needy and at their lowest, and you can help them and save their lives, that's so rewarding. So it's easy to do that.
And how do you get to be the best Dan Skovronsky that you can be for the role?
Oh, I don't know. I've yet to figure that out. I'm still on my journey and learning. For me, I think as a scientist, it's a process of experimentation, and I try different things, and then I try to observe and learn and change based on feedback. That's probably at the heart of it. I consider myself to be an introspective person and reasonably self-critical, so that probably helps me.
Yeah, and in terms of work-life balance, because this is clearly one of those roles that could be hugely overwhelming in terms of the day begins and the day ends late, or
it does, yeah. So I could probably get better at work-life balance. But when you have meaningful work that's important for you, it's easy to be dedicated to it. It's also probably easy to overdo it. Certainly, during the course of 2020, I probably tested my limits in terms of the number of hours and number of consecutive days I could work that number of hours. So I know what that is. I don't want to do that my whole life, but when called upon to do it, I will. The rest of the time, I try and balance really that with my family, and I've got a wife and 2 wonderful daughters, and I love to spend time with them. So that's what I project my time for.
And I bet they keep you grounded as well. So.
Yeah, that's right. And children keep you modern too. My kids are, I think, more more just inherently connected to the issues of our times than I would be otherwise. And I often learn a lot by talking to them and bouncing things off of them, which I appreciate. They're at that age now where they have a lot of valuable things to share.
And it's easy to have that kind of blindness, that kind of cultural blindness, right? That that I think we are being made aware of by those folks who are younger and the conversations that they're having with us now. Yeah.
This may be one of those periods of time of rapid change in cultural norms, which is always challenging, I think, for the previous generation, which I've quickly become part of, and to adapt to. So it's another thing that I think about a lot, and I want to be a modern leader, and so I'm constantly challenging myself. Even things that are outside of my comfort zone, is this the future? And if it is, I should just lean into it and let's make it happen if it's the right thing to do. That's probably happening a lot in a lot of different companies right now, but it's an extra challenge, but extra fun too.
Yeah, fantastic. So in terms of the next 5 years, what does that hold? What are your ambitions?
We're going to have a couple of those game changers. I really believe it. I talked a couple times about our drug for Alzheimer's disease. I just think we and the industry, really, science is on the verge of a major breakthrough in Alzheimer's disease, a disease that we haven't touched really with science ever really. I think we're about to unlock it. It's a combination of diagnostics and therapeutics and really understanding the heterogeneity of the disease. That's super exciting, and I'm confident will happen. I think another area is in metabolic disease, diabetes, obesity. The challenge, of course, for both of these types of innovations is going from right now where we are, which is we've unlocked the science and we've translated that into some powerful medicines, to making those medicines into widely available global solutions for hugely important disease. And probably earlier in my career, I wouldn't have recognized the challenge of that half of the business. But in some sense, that's equally challenging. And just creating a medicine and even getting it approved isn't enough. You got to get it available to people and get it used and make sure they have access and understand the right ways to use it. That's hard when you're changing medical care. It's easy when you're next in class or Me Too drug or one more important option for patients, or even an incrementally better drug. We know how to slot that in. When it's a brand new standard of care, that's harder. And we shouldn't underestimate the work that needs to be done to create that.
Oh, for sure. And I guess one of my personal ambitions is that we see more of the innovation culture applied to the commercial side of our business as well, because I think typically we've gone about it the same way we always have and haven't really thought about it differently. So it'd be nice to see
fully agree. Yeah. There's so much opportunity there, and probably the pandemic accelerates change there as well. Because for example, sales reps calling on doctors in their offices or hospitals got pushed back and relied more on digital means of communication and more on education rather than sales calls. That's probably a change that sticks and then sort of accelerates the transformation on the commercial side of things as well.
Let's keep our fingers crossed. I guess my last question is related to books. We run this as a book club as well. So are there any books that you'd recommend to anyone that'd like to know more about your philosophy or ideology?
I don't know. I find it hard to recommend specific ones of these books. I've read like most of the classic business advice management books. I enjoy them for the most part. I take something out of each one that I add to my overall arsenal of tools. Almost all of them are too narrow in my mind in prescribing one particular way of thinking about business problems or one particular outlook on innovation. But they're all useful in that they give you another tool or another vocabulary. So I usually also find those books to be a one-day read. So I sit down on a weekend usually and spend a few hours and get through it. So most then of my daily reading is actually fiction, and which I enjoy, and I need a little bit of time to unplug also, and that provides.
Do you have any recommendations?
Well, everybody's got different tastes, I would say. Sorry, you won't draw me out too easily, but yeah, I like literary fiction.
Nice. And it's such a rich seam in there as well. And I think it's actually answering questions before about the kind of the perspectives that art and music and literature bring to the challenge. So I think if you approach a challenge straight ahead, you often miss the chance to, I guess, approach it obliquely. But it sounds like obliquity is a kind of constant within your background as well.
Yeah, that could be true. Of course, our brains probably just need different types of stimulation to be healthy, and art and music and literature are all part of them. But probably there's not room for everything in life. I don't spend a lot of time, really any time, on television or on watching professional sports or things like that. So that's how I fit things in. But everybody's got different interests.
Fantastic. Last question: is there anything that you wish that I had asked you that that you'd like to get out there before we close?
No, you did a great job. Thanks for all the questions. I hope it's interesting, and I hope people find it inspiring a little bit. And what we need, of course, and I hope for, is more young people who are smart and motivated and highly trained to come join us in this pursuit of turning science into medicines. Like I said before, there's all sorts of ways to find meaning in life. This is an important one, but it's also at risk. So if we don't have a steady stream of new smart people wanting to devote their lives to this field, it could stagnate. We've seen that in other fields. So maybe here too, maybe I'll come across as too optimistic, but maybe here, the experiences of the last year help us that the world sees that science and technology applied to medicine is saving us from COVID-19 in the form of vaccines and therapies, and it's a good thing to devote your life to.
Definitely, and I think also hopefully seeing some faces. So I think I'm always hate the Hollywood version of pharmaceutical companies. Typically bad actors and evil people, but I think the more C-suite folks that the people get to meet, I think the more they realize that some people with some real passion and commitment to doing good things. So,
I hope you're right. Yeah.
You've been a great example of that. So Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mike. It's great talking.
If people want to know any more about you, is it easy? Are you on Twitter or any other place they can find you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, not on Twitter. Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So Dan, thank you so much, and good luck with the next few months.
Great. Have a great day. Enjoy the ocean.
Thank you. Bye.